The letter arrived on a Tuesday, and Adelaide Marsh read it, standing at the kitchen window with her back to the door, because she didn't want anyone to see her face while she was reading it. I know you're in Cheyenne. I know about the shop. Come home or I'll come to you. You already know which one is easier. No signature. Edmund never signed. He didn't need to. She folded the letter into quarters and pressed it flat against her hip and stood there a moment longer, watching the street below. Then she walked to the back room, pulled her travel bag from under the cot, and started deciding what she could carry. Everything she owned fit into one bag and a wooden sewing kit the size of a shoebox, which her mother had painted blue when Adelaide was 9. The paint was mostly gone now. The hinges were stiff. Inside, nested in faded velvet, were the needles her mother had left her, 43 of them, organized by eye size, and a stack of pattern cards tied with a length of yellow ribbon. She had kept that kit through 2 years of Edmund's house, through the months when he'd made her feel that everything she touched either belonged to him or was an embarrassment. He had never cared about the sewing. He thought it was beneath him, women's work, and that was the one way he had accidentally protected it. By ignoring it, he had left it entirely hers. She was on the westbound stage by nightfall. The town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming, didn't have a train station. It had a freight depot and a hand-lettered sign nailed to a fence post that said Bitter CK, Pop, 214, and one of the 4s had been scratched out and replaced with a 3 in a different handwriting. The stage stopped for 20 minutes to change horses, and those 20 minutes were enough for Adelaide to decide that this was exactly the kind of place that a man like Edmund Voss would consider too small to bother with. She asked the driver if there was work in the area. He said there was a ranch, the Hale place, about 6 miles out, lost their cook and their seamstress in the same month. Winter coming. They'd be looking. She asked how to get there. He looked at her the way men look at women they've already decided are wrong for the situation. She was used to that look. She'd been receiving some version of it her entire adult life. She was 29 years old, fuller figured than fashion approved of, with red-chapped hands and a blue sewing kit, and exactly enough money left for 2 nights at a boarding house. She carried her bag to the freight office and asked them to hold it. Then she walked to the Hale Ranch. It took her an hour and 40 minutes over frozen ruts. She counted her steps for the first mile to stop thinking about Edmund, and after that the landscape did the work for her. Wyoming in late October was the kind of beautiful that didn't apologize for itself. The sky was enormous, and the color of a bruise healing to yellow at the edges, and the mountains in the distance looked like something painted by someone who had never seen mountains and was working from a description. The man who met her in the yard was not the rancher. He was the foreman, a broad-shouldered man named Prentice, and he had the expression of someone who had been doing a job for so long that he no longer remembered what it had felt like when it was new. He looked at her sewing kit, looked at her again. "You walk here?" he said. "Yes," she said. "From town?" "Yes." He studied her a moment longer. Then he said, "The rancher's in the south barn. I'll take you." His name was Jonas Hale. She learned this because Prentice said it once, flatly, when they walked into the barn, and then didn't say anything else. Jonas was standing at a workbench with his back to them, and when he turned, Adelaide's first thought was that he looked like a man who hadn't slept properly in a long time, and had stopped expecting that to change. He was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way that comes from working outdoors, with dark smudges under his eyes, and the particular careful stillness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for long enough that holding it had become automatic. He looked at her the way Prentice had, sizing her up, but his eyes stayed on her face, which she noticed. He asked if she could sew. She said she could do more than sew. "What does that mean?" he said. "It means I can sew," she said, "and I can mend leather and patch canvas and cut patterns from scratch and teach anyone who wants to learn. It means I've been doing this since I was 11 years old, and I know what I'm doing." He was quiet for a moment. She had learned in recent years not to fill silences that weren't hers to fill. "Terms," he said finally. "Room and board and a wage. The sewing room is off the main house. You don't go to the second floor. That's for family." She understood. She nodded. "One more thing," he said, and he stopped in a way she would come to recognize, a full stop, like a man who had started towards something and found the road closed. "My son," he said. "He's 7. He doesn't speak. Not since," he stopped again, "not since his mother passed. He doesn't interact with strangers. If you see him, give him space." She said, "Of course." She didn't see the boy that first day. She saw the sewing room, which was a disaster. She saw the pile of mending that had accumulated in the months since the previous seamstress had gone. Shirts with split seams, a saddle blanket being used as a patch for something else, 2 coats with the lining hanging loose. The good lamp had a cracked chimney. The thread supply was nearly gone. Someone had used the best scissors to cut twine, which had left small metal burrs along both blades. She set her mother's kit on the cleanest corner of the table. We made it, she thought. Not to the kit exactly, just to herself. To the part of herself she'd kept alive through all of it. She worked until midnight, not because anyone asked, because the mending pile represented work that needed doing, and because she was tired and frightened in the specific way she always got when she arrived somewhere new. The fear that she'd miscalculated, that this place wouldn't hold her. Working with her hands was the only thing that quieted that particular fear. She threaded a needle by lamplight and started on the first shirt and let the rhythm of it take over, the pull of thread through cloth, the small satisfaction when a seam held. She was still at the table when she felt it. Not a sound exactly, a change in the quality of the silence. She didn't look up immediately. She had learned something about frightened things, horses, stray dogs, children in difficult houses, which was that looking directly at them too fast was the same as reaching for them, and reaching for them before they'd decided you were safe always sent them back into the dark. She kept her eyes on the shirt and reached, without hurrying, for her mother's pattern tin. She set it on the edge of the table closest to the doorway, not toward whoever was there, just somewhere visible. She heard nothing. Then the faintest shift of weight on the floorboard. Then the pattern tin moved, barely, just a small scrape of metal on wood, and was still. 30 seconds passed, maybe more. When she finally looked up, the doorway was empty. On the table where the tin had sat, there was a single horsehair, black, twisted into a neat loop about the size of a coin. She picked it up and set it in the windowsill where she could see it while she worked. She sewed until the lamp ran low. Her hands weren't shaking anymore, which she counted as enough for one night. Jonas came to find her the next morning at 6 o'clock. The sewing room was already different, not fixed but organized. The mending pile divided into categories. The cracked lamp chimney replaced with a spare she'd found in the supply cupboard. 3 shirts already finished, and hanging on the line she'd strung from the hook by the door. He looked at the shirts for a moment. Then he looked at her. "You worked through the night," he said. "Not all of it." He nodded slowly. "There's more mending in the bunkhouse. Prentice can bring it over." She said, "All right." He was turning to leave when she said, "Your son left me something last night." He went very still. "A horsehair," she said, "twisted into a loop. I thought you'd want to know in case he mentioned it, or in case he didn't." Jonas turned back around slowly. "He came to the sewing room," he repeated, and it wasn't a question. He did. "He hasn't." Another one of those stops. A sentence that led somewhere too painful and found the road closed. He stood there a moment. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." He left. She listened to his boots on the porch and thought, "There's a weight in this house, an old one, something set down a long time ago and never picked back up." She threaded a fresh needle and got back to work. By the end of the first week, she had worked through most of the mending pile and started on a set of curtains Jonas had asked for, without explanation. Heavy wool, the kind that kept cold air from finding the gaps. She'd also figured out the personalities of most of the ranch hands. Prentice ran the operation the way a clockmaker runs a clock, with precision and without sentimentality. He didn't trust her yet. That was fine. She wasn't in any hurry to be trusted. She was in a hurry to be useful, and she'd found that usefulness had its own way of making an argument that didn't need words. Levi, the youngest hand, was maybe 22, with the kind of face that still showed everything he felt before he had time to hide it. He left the mending bin outside the sewing room each Monday morning with the exactness of someone who had decided this was his job now and intended to do it properly. Then there was Tomas, who had been at Hale Ranch for 9 years, and who said almost nothing but observed everything. On her 4th day, he passed the sewing room window and she heard him stop. Then very quietly, he said something to himself in Spanish she didn't quite catch. She kept working. An hour later, a fresh length of good candle appeared on the windowsill beside the horsehair loop. She kept both of them there. She was building a small collection of things left without comment, by people who hadn't yet decided to say what they meant out loud. Eli found his own pattern. She heard the specific floorboard, the loose one, second from the bottom of the interior stairs, every morning somewhere between 5 and 6. She learned not to look up when she heard it. She kept her motion steady, the pull of thread through cloth, the snip of scissors, the unhurried rhythm of someone who wasn't watching. After a variable amount of time, sometimes 2 minutes, sometimes 10, the air would shift the way it does when someone has decided a space is safe, and Eli would appear in the doorway. Never all the way in, always the doorway. Always in partial shadow, with those enormous dark eyes taking in everything with the intense and wordless concentration of someone building a careful model of the world. She started leaving things at the edge of the table. A biscuit from breakfast, a small square of soft flannel she had no use for. Once, a short length of braided cord in 3 colors, made from scraps in about 5 minutes, just to see what would happen. The cord disappeared. In its place the next morning, a small smooth stone, round dark gray, with a faint white line running through it like a seam. She put it next to the horsehair loop on the windowsill. Jonah saw the collection once. He was passing through and stopped when his eyes landed on it. The stone, the horsehair, a dried seed pod she'd received the week before, and the expression on his face was something she chose not to name. He picked up his conversation with Prentice and walked out. She heard him pause just past the door and stand there for a count of 5. Then his boots moved on. She didn't know what that meant. She decided not to know. 3 weeks in, Prentice came to her with a problem she'd already seen coming. The mending work from the ranch would eventually run out. She'd known this since the first week, had been watching the pile diminish with the same attention she paid to everything she needed to survive somewhere. She had a proposal ready. She told him she needed to know if there was anyone in Bitter Creek who might want regular mending done. And she told him about the railroad camp east of town. Pete Aldridge at the Mercantile had mentioned it. 300 men working a line extension, eating poorly and wearing their kit to rags. Prentice looked at her list of what she'd need to expand the operation. He looked at it long enough that she started to wonder if she'd misjudged the situation. Then he said in a tone that was working very hard not to be impressed, "This is organized." It came out slightly like an accusation. "I've been keeping track of what we're using," she said. "If you want, I can put together projections for the next 2 months." A pause. "Supply projections," he said. "I know sewing," she said. "Sewing needs supplies, it's not complicated." He folded the list. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite acknowledgement, but not dismissal either. She went to Bitter Creek herself on Saturday, with Levi driving the wagon. She found the general store run by a woman named Edith Pruitt, who looked like she hadn't taken a day off in 4 years, and seemed actively relieved about it. When Adelaide unfolded the sample mending she'd brought, Edith put on her spectacles and examined it for a full minute without speaking. "How much?" Edith said finally. Adelaide named a price. Edith's eyes did the quick calculation that people's eyes always do when they're figuring out whether something is worth it or whether they're being played. "Deal," Edith said. "Come back Thursday and I'll have a pile for you." That was the beginning of what Adelaide was already privately thinking of as the possibility, the early small shape of an idea that hadn't fully formed yet, that sewing might be more than a way to earn her keep at Hale Ranch. The thing she hadn't fully expected was how much the boy would matter to her. Eli was 7 years old and had not spoken a word to a single adult in 2 years. She knew the shape of why without knowing the details, the way you know the shape of a wound through a bandage. His mother had been ill for a long time, the slow kind, and Eli had been present for more of it than a child should be. The silence afterward had come like a door that hadn't opened since. She knew that shape. She'd been inside something like it herself. Not grief, but the particular silence you build around yourself when the world has proven it will use whatever noise you make against you. She did not try to reach him. She left things at the edge of the table and kept her eyes on her work and let the distance be his to decide. But on a Wednesday morning in November, she was working through a pattern she had drawn from memory. Her mother's wedding quilt design, the one she'd been turning over in her head for years without having time to make, and she was doing a portion of it wrong. She didn't know she was doing it wrong. She'd been working from memory, and one of the triangles was rotated a full 90 degrees off where it should have been, which would only matter when she reached the border and found nothing aligned. She heard Eli in the doorway, the usual stillness, the usual presence that was almost a sound. She kept working. Then a voice said very quietly, "That's wrong." She went completely still, 2 words, the first word she'd heard from him in 3 weeks of mornings. She did not look up. She was fairly certain that looking up too fast would be the equivalent of startling a colt that had just put its nose over a fence for the first time. "What's wrong with it?" she said to the pattern. "That piece," the voice said. "It goes the other way." She set down the fabric. Very slowly, she looked at the triangle she'd been working on, and she understood what he meant. He was right. She turned it and everything changed. The pattern clicked into itself the way a key clicks into a lock. "You're right," she said. "To the pattern mostly. To the room." Silence, a long one. She went back to sewing. When she looked at the doorway a minute later, Eli had come 2 steps closer. "My mother made one," he said. "It was blue." Adelaide kept her eyes on her hands. "Did you like it?" she said. "It was on my bed," he said. "Then it's gone now." She didn't say anything for a moment. She cut a length of thread and rethreaded her needle, a task that required no thought, but gave her hands something to do. "Mine's going to be red and yellow," she said. "My mother liked red. I like yellow." Another silence. "Why are you making it?" he asked. Eli's voice had the careful flatness of a child who had learned to ask questions in a way that didn't reveal how much the answer mattered. "Because I've been carrying the pattern in my head for a long time," she said. "It seemed like time to put it somewhere real." He considered this. Then he crossed the rest of the distance to the table and stood beside her and looked at the squares she'd laid out. He didn't touch them. He studied them with the same focused attention he gave everything, head slightly tilted, brow furrowed in a way that made him look remarkably like his father. "This one's wrong too," he said and pointed. She looked. He was right again. "I need you to keep checking me," she said, as though she were asking a professional favor. He almost smiled. She saw the edge of it before he caught it, the small involuntary movement at the corner of his mouth that he pulled back before it could become anything definite. He stayed for 20 minutes. He didn't speak much more, but he was there, a solid, quiet presence at the edge of the table, and when he left, he walked out with ordinary footsteps, like someone leaving a room they had a right to be in. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the quilt squares. Something tight in her chest that had been there so long, she'd stopped noticing it had loosened by a single degree. She understood something in that moment she hadn't quite understood before, that the healing was not only his, that some part of her, the part that had been told for 2 years she was too much and not enough and wrong in the specific ways that made her useful, was also coming back into proportion in this room. It was Eli who had done it. His trust, offered without ceremony or permission asked, had done what 2 months of new scenery hadn't managed. She filed that away. She would think about it later when she had the words for it. She picked up her needle and kept working. The letter from Edmund arrived on a Thursday. She opened it standing at the sewing room table. "You've made this harder than it needed to be. I know about the ranch. I know about the Hale family. Come home before I arrive, and this ends quietly. Stay, and nothing about it stays quiet." She folded the letter, set it down, put her hands flat on the table, and breathed. She'd known this was coming the way you know a winter is coming, not the exact day, but the unmistakable quality of the air before it arrives. She thought about running. The thought lasted 30 seconds, and in those 30 seconds, she had already built the shape of it. Leva's wagon, the southbound stage, a new city, a new name, another beginning from nothing. She was good at starting over. She'd had practice. She picked up the letter and read the last line again. Nothing about it stays quiet. Edmund's threat was never about her. That was the thing she'd taken years to understand about him. His threat was always about whoever you'd allowed yourself to care about. He came at you by going around you, working from whatever was softest. She put the letter in her apron pocket. Then she went to find Jonas. He was in the east pasture with Prentice. She walked out to them without particular hurry, which was hard, and waited until Jonas saw her coming. She handed him the letter without explanation. He read it. His face didn't change visibly. She had come to understand that Jonas went most still when he was most concerned, which was the opposite of how most people worked. "This is the man from St. Louis," he said. "Yes." He folded the letter. Then he said simply, "You're not leaving this ranch, because some man thinks he's owed something he isn't owed." "He has money," she said, "lawyers. He has a way of finding the weakest point and working from there." "Every man's got a way of working," Prentice said from behind her. She'd half forgotten he was there. The foreman was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, older than his baseline. Queter. He has money and lawyers, Prentice said. We've got the whole of this operation and every man on it. He paused. That's not nothing. She didn't know what to say to that. She'd spent enough years being told she was nothing without a particular man's protection that hearing the opposite, plainly and without performance, required a moment to locate. Tell me everything about him, Jonah said, all of it. She told it the way she'd never told anyone. Not the charity house in Cheyenne, not the woman she'd boarded with before that. She told it starting from the first year, when Edmund had been attentive in a way that felt like being chosen, and about the second year, when attentive had become something else. About the specific gradual way it had worked, not one dramatic moment but a slow series of small adjustments, each one reasonable in isolation, each one landing before she'd registered the last. She told them about the morning she'd finally understood, with the terrible clarity that sometimes comes all at once after arriving in pieces for years, that she had become a smaller person than she'd started as, and that the smallness wasn't her nature, it had been made. She rolled up her sleeve and showed them the scar on her forearm, long faded now to silver. She didn't explain it in detail, she didn't need to. Jonas looked at it for a long moment. When he looked up, his expression was very controlled in the particular way she recognized as the place right underneath something significant. Not pity, she'd have shut down immediately for pity. Something more careful than that, something that cost him something to manage. She pulled her sleeve back down. He's going to come here, she said, and he'll look for whoever you care most about and apply pressure there. That's how he works. There's something else, she said. She'd been building toward this for a week. You keep stopping when Drummond's name comes up. Silence. Tell me where things actually stand, she said. I'm not asking because I want to worry. I'm asking because two threats are harder to manage separately than together, and I have a feeling they already know each other. Jonas and Prentice exchanged a look. Then Jonas sat on the fence rail beside her and told her the truth about Hale Ranch's finances. Pierce Drummond wanted the north parcel, the land that sat between the ranch and the creek access that kept the summer operation viable. He'd been applying pressure for 8 months, title disputes, slowed material deliveries, pressure through the bank. The debt was real, the window was closing. And Drummond was the kind of man who got patient when he could smell the end of something. She listened to all of it. Then she told Jonas what she'd been calculating for 2 weeks, the standing mending orders, the projected income from Edith Pruitt's network, and the railroad camp, the approach to the bank before Drummond could move on it first. When she finished, the east pasture was quiet except for the horses shifting in the cold. You've been watching this ranch, Jonas said. I've been paying attention, she said. That's not the same thing, but it's close. She paused. Where did you learn to think this way? He asked. She looked at him, from a man who spent 2 years making sure I understood that he was the one who did the thinking. I paid close attention to how he did it. I didn't take his name when I left. I took his methods. Something shifted in Jonas's face that she wasn't going to call by name yet. Edmund came on a Friday with 2 hired men and the pleasant, settled expression he always carried. The expression that said, I am a reasonable man who simply wants what is reasonable. She had once mistaken it for kindness. She was in the yard when the horses came through the gate. Jonas was beside her. Edmund looked at Jonas first, a brief professional assessment. Then he looked at her and his expression did what it always did. Warm, certain, practiced. Adelaide, he said, you look well. She said nothing. He introduced himself to Jonas as an old friend, the word doing the exact work he'd designed it to do. Jonas said, I know who you are. Edmund registered this without visibly reacting. Then he looked back at her. You've put these people in a difficult position, he said to her gently. Adelaide has a tendency toward impulsive decisions, he said to Jonas. I don't say that critically. It's simply her nature. She acts and then considers consequences after the fact. I'm here because I care about what happens to her. She had spent a long time being afraid of those words, afraid of the way he could arrange true and untrue things together until they sounded like the same thing. She'd heard his voice in her head saying impulsive and her nature long after she'd left, and she'd flinched at it. She found, standing in the Hale yard in the cold Wyoming morning, that she was not flinching. She's made excellent decisions here, Jonas said. His voice hadn't changed at all. She's kept this operation running through a hard season and done it well. I'm not sure which version of her you're describing, but it doesn't match the woman I know. Edmund looked at her. The warmth went a degree cooler. Come home, Adelaide, he said. We can resolve this privately. No, she said. The word came out steadier than she'd expected. She felt it come out and felt something shift behind her ribs when it did. She looked at him directly. I'm not going with you. There's nothing to resolve. You don't have a claim on me that I agreed to, and the ones you invented are finished. A silence. There are legal matters, he said, financial instruments, things that followed you out of St. Louis. She said, name them. A pause. She said it again, name one specific debt, one legal instrument with a date on it, be specific. She had never in 2 years asked him to be specific. She'd accepted the general shape of his authority because the general shape had been enough, and she hadn't understood yet what specificity would reveal. The pause lasted long enough to mean something. Mr. Voss. The voice came from behind her, Prentice, and then she heard more footsteps, more than one pair, and she understood without turning that the ranch hands had assembled at the edge of the yard in the particular arrangement of men who want to be present without appearing to have been sent. You're on private property, Prentice said, and from what I'm hearing, you've come here without anything concrete to say. Edmund looked at the assembled men. His hired hands shifted. Something changed in his expression, the specific stillness of a man reassessing an equation that isn't adding up. He had come expecting to find her isolated. He hadn't accounted for Prentice and Levi and Tomas, standing in the yard looking at him like a problem they'd already decided how to handle. This isn't finished, Edmund said. It's been finished, she said. You just didn't hear it the first time. He left. The hoofbeats faded. Levi let out a long breath. Tomas said nothing and gave her the same nod he'd given her the day she'd asked about the railroad camp, the small, serious one that meant acknowledged. Prentice watched until the horses were out of the gate and then turned and said in his flattest voice, 2 men watching the road tonight, starting now. She became aware that Jonas's hand was at her elbow, not holding, just present at the edge of contact, light enough that she could move away from it without effort, which was exactly the difference between him and the man who had just ridden away. She didn't move away from it. He'll go to Drummond, she said quietly to Jonas. Tonight or tomorrow. That's the next move. He knows Drummond is already pressing you, and he'll offer to help push harder in exchange for whatever access he can get. You know this because you know how he thinks, Jonas said. Yes, he doesn't stop. He finds the new angle. Drummond is the best angle available to him here. Then we need to move faster on the bank, Jonas said. Yes, she said, and we need someone looking at his history in St. Louis. He was quiet for a moment. I may know someone, investigative work, not local law. He owes me a conversation. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this since the night I told you everything. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to make promises I couldn't keep, Jonas said. But yes. Write to him tonight, she said. He did. The territorial investigator arrived 10 days later. His name was Cal Rourke, and he had the look of a man who had spent 30 years watching other people make mistakes and had arrived at a kind of peaceful clarity about human nature. He sat at the kitchen table, opened his satchel, and placed 3 folders on the table with the methodical care of someone who had organized his materials before he arrived. Edmund Voss is known to this office, he said without preamble, not by case file, by pattern. There have been 4 women in 12 years, each with circumstances matching yours. In 2 cases, documents were signed under coercive conditions. He paused. In 1 case, the outcome was worse than that. She kept her hands flat on the table. 1 woman, Rourke continued, is in Kansas City. 1 is in Denver. Her name is Margaret Fowler. She's been trying quietly for 2 years to find the others. She contacted my office 6 months ago. What does she need? Adelaide said. Someone willing to be public, Rourke said. He looked at her steadily. I want to know if you're willing to testify. You need to understand what that means. Formal proceedings, his lawyers. Your history examined in ways that won't be comfortable. He paused. And you need to understand that it matters. What you know, said plainly in the right room, changes the equation for every woman who came before you, and every woman who would have come after. She thought about the word impulsive, and how many years she had believed it. Can I write to Margaret Fowler? She said. Rourke reached into the satchel and produced a card with an address on it. She asked me to give this to you if you were willing. Adelaide held the card. Can I write tonight? Yes, he said. She wrote the letter that same evening. She wrote it plainly, the way she sewed, clean lines, nothing wasted. She told Margaret Fowler who she was and where she was, and that she was not leaving. She said she was willing to stand in any room that needed her standing in it. She sealed the letter and left it for the Morning Post. Then she went back to the quilt. The formal proceedings happened in the spring, in the territorial courthouse in Cheyenne, and they were everything Rourke had warned her they would be. Edmund's lawyers were meticulous and expensive, and very good at arranging true things, so they pointed in wrong directions. She testified for 3 hours. She told the truth. Margaret Fowler testified. She was a quiet woman who had been looking for exactly this room for 2 years, and she held herself on the stand with the steadiness of someone who had come prepared and intended to use every minute of it. Jonas sat beside her in the courthouse corridor. Prentice was there without being asked. Levi was there and was trying hard to look like he wasn't nervous and was not managing it. Eli had made her something before she left. He'd brought it to the sewing room the morning of the day they departed, a small square of fabric, 4 triangles sewn together in the pattern she'd taught him, roughly but earnestly done, the seams not quite even. He didn't look at her when he held it out. He looked at the square. The colors were red and yellow. "Finished it last night," he said. She held it in her hands in the courthouse corridor and thought about patterns and the way things aligned when you finally got the geometry right. Guilty on 5 of the 7 charges. Not everything, not the complete accounting she might have wanted in a world that worked the way it should, but enough. The public record was enough. The sentencing was enough. Edmund looked at her once when he left the courtroom. She met his eyes. He looked away first. She walked out of that courthouse into Wyoming Spring with Jonas's hand in hers. She'd taken it somewhere in the 3rd hour of waiting, and neither of them had mentioned it, and she stood on the wooden steps in the sun and breathed air that smelled like mud and new grass, and the particular freshness of a landscape remembering itself after a long winter. She didn't feel what she'd expected to feel. She'd expected something dramatic, relief, triumph, a door closing with weight. What she felt was quieter than that and more durable. The solid, ordinary sensation of having done a hard thing all the way to its end and being still standing. That was enough. Pierce Drummond withdrew his title challenge 2 weeks after the trial. He sent a letter that listed practical reasons and was honest about none of them, and the honest reason was visible underneath all 3. Hale Ranch was no longer the failing operation he'd been counting on, and the man whose help he'd accepted to pressure it had just been publicly convicted of fraud and coercion in a territorial court. Adelaide set the letter on the kitchen table and said, "Done." Jonas looked at her, something in his face that she'd been watching build for months, not quickly but solidly, the way things build on ground that can hold them. "Not quite," he said. He sat across from her at the corner, the working position, the same side they always took when they were looking at the same problem from the same direction, and he looked at his hands for a moment. "I'm out of practice at saying things that matter," he said. 2 years of not saying them does something to the muscle. She waited. "I love you," he said. He said it plainly, without ornament, the way he said everything that was true. "I've been certain of it since the morning Eli came to tell me what you'd said about carrying the pattern in your head." He looked up. "That's a strange thing to fall in love with someone over. I know that." "It's not strange," she said. "I'm not asking you for anything," he said. "You don't owe me," he stopped. "You don't owe anyone anything. I want you to know that first. If that's the whole of it, I understand." She looked at him, at the dark circles he'd probably always have, at the careful way he'd learned to say true things, at the face of a man who had loved one person completely and had not expected to find himself in any room like this one again. "I love you too," she said. "I've been less sure about the timing." The corner of his mouth moved. "Is the timing all right now?" She said, "I think the timing is all right now." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand over and held it, and they sat like that in the kitchen, with the Wyoming morning coming through the windows. They married in September in the yard because neither of them wanted a church, and Eli had said the yard was better for horses to attend, which was treated as a serious logistical point and acted on accordingly. Prentice shook Jonas's hand with his whole arm and told Adelaide that the ranch accounts were in good order, which was his version of a blessing. Levi cried openly and seemed unbothered by it. Tomas stood near the fence and held his hat and looked genuinely moved and had absolutely no intention of showing anyone. Edith Pruitt came from town and brought a cake she'd made badly and presented with the confidence of someone who knows the gesture matters more than the execution. Eli stood between them. He had started speaking again in the weeks before the wedding, not in a rush, not all at once, but the way a creek comes back after a drought. First a trickle, then more, single words, then sentences. Then one morning at the sewing table, while Adelaide was setting the final border on the finished quilt, the red and yellow one, the one she'd been carrying in her head for years, he had looked at it and said, quietly, and with the certainty of someone who had thought it through, "It's better than I thought it would be." She'd kept her expression even. "So is everything," she said. He'd nodded as though this was a satisfactory answer and gone back to inspecting the seam work. At the wedding, standing between Jonas and Adelaide while the circuit preacher read the words, Eli reached up and took Adelaide's hand. Afterward, in the yard with the cake and the noise of people being genuinely happy without performing it, Eli tugged on her sleeve. She bent down. "Can I call you Mama?" he asked. He asked it carefully, in the serious way he asked everything that mattered, the same way he'd asked about the quilt pattern, the same way he'd said that's wrong in the doorway on the morning everything changed. She had known this question would arrive at some point. She hadn't known it would hit her the way it did, not like a weight, like something releasing, like the last corner of a pattern finally fitting where it was always supposed to go. "If that's what you want," she said. He considered it with the gravity he brought to all important things. "That's what I want," he said. Then he turned back to informing Levi with some authority that his piece of cake was structurally inferior to everyone else's, and shouldn't he just take a different one? The yard was full of noise and Wyoming evening light, and Adelaide stood in the middle of all of it and looked at the sewing room window, where her mother's kit sat on the sill beside a horsehair loop and a smooth gray stone. She thought, "I carried the pattern all this way. Look what it became."